Okay, so the recording has started. Now, the standard ritual. Does anybody have any questions?
Sir, I have a question from lecture 5.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
you said that whenever KVL equation is linear, then we can use complex voltages because the real and imaginary parts satisfy the linear equations.
Yes.
And you said that we cannot use the same prescription for Schrodinger equation, right?
For the Schrodinger equation was not, it's not just linearity. There are two things there. It's linearity and as well as the equations being real. Okay, let me just illustrate what happens for the Schrodinger equation. Let me just wait
Meaning
until
the
this comes.
coefficients you're talking about, right?
Yeah. So Schrodinger equation. By the way, which one is the Schrodinger equation? Can you tell me
H
that?
psi is equal to iota h by del psi del t.
Yeah, right. So let's write down the one-dimensional version. Right, this is your Schrodinger equation. Now, does the real part and imaginary part of the complex wave function actually satisfy the Schrodinger equation?
Not really.
No, right? Because if you put in psi equal to say u plus iv, I can use I here. It is in as long as we are dealing with complex with quantum mechanics. There's no problem with the square root of -1 being called I. Of course, in electronics, we are going to call it J, simply so that we don't confuse it with the current. So the basic idea is simply this is what happens to the left-hand side.
Are you presenting something that I cannot see?
Oh, sorry. Stupid of me, I forgot to start the presentation. Oh, I actually started the presentation. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay, minus h cross square by twice m. So let's even forget about the potential for the time being. Let's just talk about the free particle and see what happens. So all I've done is, let's say, drop the potential. So you have the free particle Schrodinger equation. And in that, if you put in psi equal to u plus iv, then what will happen is the left-hand side, the imaginary part has u in it, right? Because of the extra I in front. And the real part actually is the one with v in it. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, there is no extra factor of I. So the real part has u and the imaginary part has v. So as a result of this, the equation in terms of the real and imaginary parts of the Schrodinger equation, Schrodinger wave function for a free particle simply becomes this. Sorry. If you just think of the real part, then what will happen? The real part has, okay, just look at the imaginary part first. I h cross del u del t on this side, and that becomes equal to minus h cross square by twice m del 2 v del x2 on the other side. And h cross del v del t, which is the real part with the minus sign, is minus h cross square by twice m del 2 u del x2. So you can see that neither the real part nor the imaginary part actually obeys Schrodinger's equation. They actually obey a kind of coupled differential equation where u's equation has v in it and v's equation has u in it. So the presence of the extra I outside in the IH cross del u del t, or whether you call it iota or whatever, the same thing, that actually essentially ends up with mixing up the real and imaginary parts, and so you no longer have an equation which the real part satisfies and one which the imaginary part satisfies.
Okay, so it's about the
So
coefficient, whether it's real or complex.
yeah, it's about the coefficient here, right? Because it's So the point is really whether the equation is real. Equation being real means all coefficients in everything is everywhere is real.
So
If that
similarly,
happens,
can we use
Mhm.
this prescription in for Maxwell's equations,
You can. In fact, you do.
like a
In
complex electric
in
field
fact,
or
okay. By
complex
the way,
magnetic
this, although this is a bit away from our basic course, but let me just point out that Maxwell's equations. What are they? In free. So let me just take a look at a special case of Maxwell's equations. Free space without charge and current. Equations will be these, right? Divergence of B equals 0. Curl of E. So I'm using SI units. That's what they're going to look like. And curl of B is how much? Anybody? What is the curl of B?
Mu naught epsilon naught del del t.
Yeah. It's mu naught epsilon naught del E del T.
or 1 by c square del delta.
Oh, 1 by, well, we don't call it 1 by c square at this stage simply because we do not know it's 1 by c square. We will learn is 1 by c square from the equations. Of course, it's equal to 1 by c square. But I'm just saying at this stage, you don't know that there is a speed of light lurking in these equations somewhere unless you solve the wave equation. Now, you all know that you can, from these equations, you can show that E and B separately obey the wave equation. So one kind of solution to the wave equation is simply this: E equals some constant E0 that satisfies the wave equation. But the important, remember the wave equation here is Laplacian of E minus 1 by c squared del 2 E del T2 is 0. Now will this E satisfy the wave equation? Or then you have to just plug it in, right? Now the beautiful thing here is, first of all, del del T on an exponential can simply be replaced by multiplication by I omega, right? If you're dealing only with such exponential functions, might just as well say del del T is minus I omega. Of course, it's not minus I omega, but as far as exponential functions of this kind are concerned, doing a partial derivative with respect to t and multiplying by minus I omega are exactly the same thing, right? And what about doing a grad? What will that be? Say, okay, what will del x be? Let's get that first. If you are only confining yourselves to exponential solutions like this, what would del x be? If you were to differentiate, if you were to differentiate this partially with respect to x, remember the x here is in the k dot r. K dot r is kxx plus kyy plus kzz. So this will basically be the same as multiplication by ikx. Can easily check that this actually trans to this, that when you do gradient or apply the del operator, that's essentially the same as multiplication by I times the vector k. Okay, and Laplacian simply is doing this twice, so calculating the Laplacian of this is the same as multiplication by minus k square, that is minus k vector magnitude square. So this equation actually ends up being, this is a second derivative, right? Because it's a second derivative, minus I squares to minus 1. So you end up with plus omega square by c square times E equals 0. Okay? So that is what the wave equation becomes. Of course, here I have already used the fact that what you really get is Laplacian E minus mu naught epsilon naught del 2 E del T2. But since as you have already said, you know mu naught epsilon naught is 1 by c square, I've just used that. So the important point here is that this tells you that a wave like this will satisfy this wave equation, which is a consequence of Maxwell's equation. only if this thing vanishes, that only if you have omega square by k square equal to c square, where c square, of course, is our combination 1 over mu naught epsilon naught. But the important thing is when you have a wave like this, omega is the frequency, angular frequency, k is the wave number, again, angular wave number. And the ratio is simply the speed with which the plane progressive wave progresses. So this immediately tells you that omega by k, the ratio, has to be equal to c, which is 1 by root over mu naught epsilon naught. So the electromagnetic waves has to travel at this particular speed. That's one conclusion. But you might say that you already knew that. But the point is, what this mathematics is telling you is that ultimately, if you have a complex wave-like thing like this, that is going to satisfy the equations which Maxwell actually gave you, only if the velocity of the wave is given by 1 over root over mu naught epsilon naught. But even more than that, this is a complex quantity, right? An electric field, which describes a light or any other electromagnetic wave, cannot be a complex quantity. It has to be a real quantity. However, once again, the issue is if you look at the 4 Maxwell equations, they're all linear equations. There's no squaring involved anywhere or multiplication of fields involved anywhere. These are just linear equations where you take the field components and you do derivatives of them. And derivative is a linear operation. Because these are linear and real equations. Real is, of course, important here. If a complex field satisfies these equations, then the real part and imaginary part also satisfy the equation. And so when you say E is actually E0 e to the I k dot r minus omega t, you don't really mean that. You mean the electric field is actually magnitude of E0 times cosine of k dot r minus omega t plus phi, where phi is nothing but the phase of E0. Basically, what you're talking about here is a plane progressive wave, which is a sinusoid, described as a cosine function. But for the ease of the mathematics involved, you can easily use the exponential. And you can legitimately use the exponential because the equations are linear and real. So the answer to your question is yes. But let me just show you something else. Let me just show you how useful this can be. If you assume both your electric and magnetic fields are of this exponential plane progressive wave form, then this immediately tells you something. For example, what does this equation tell you? Divergence of E equal to 0. What does it tell you about the wave? What is divergence equivalent to?
The charge density.
No, that's physically equal to the charge density. Here there's no charge density, right? But what is divergence equal to mathematically? If you do del on a wave like this, the dictionary I wrote down a while ago, doing del t is the same as minus I omega. Only for such complex waves, of course. But for in the same spirit, doing a divergence of an exponential E0 into the I k dot r minus omega t. What is that equivalent to? I wrote the dictionary down for you, right? Because del t is equivalent to minus I omega. Again, this is not generally not true for all functions. This is true only when you have plane progressive wave kind of solution. But when you have that, then del operation is the same as ik. Divergence is the same as ik dot e. You can, of course, calculate the whole thing and show that this is true. But what you really get is this. So what do these two equations tell you about the electric and the magnetic field?
That they are perpendicular to each other.
No, not really, not these two.
They are perpendicular to the wave propagation vector.
Exactly. These two equations tell you that they are both perpendicular to the wave propagation vector. K dot E is 0 and K dot B is 0. Okay. These two equations don't tell you that E and B are perpendicular to each
Oh, yeah,
other.
if we can prove E cross B is equal to 0, then it
That actually comes from here. You don't have to do that. Look at this. What does this tell you? It tells you ik cross E is my I omega times B. So B is actually K cross E by omega. right? So this tells you that for a plane propagating wave, only for plane propagating waves, propagating in a vacuum, the magnetic field actually is related to the electric field by this particular equation. This is the equation for the complex versions, but the real parts also obey the same equation. So B is actually going to be K cross E by omega, being a cross product of E with some other vector. It has to be perpendicular to E as well. Okay. In fact, it tells you a lot. It tells you what is the magnitude of B compared to the magnitude of E. It can allow you to compare the magnetic energy density with electrical energy density and so on. All of this is standard stuff that you do whenever you study electromagnetic waves. Okay. But the answer to what you asked at the beginning is simply yes. Because Maxwell's equations are linear and real, you can actually use complex waves in place of real waves. Makes your life a lot easier. In fact, that's exactly what is used everywhere. But once again, you have to be careful. When you calculate the energy density, for example, what is the energy density for an electric field in EM theory? How much energy density?
Half epsilon naught E square.
Right. But that's not a linear thing, right? It's square. Magnetic field is B square by 2 mu 0. Again, not a linear thing. And I'm pretty sure you also know the expression for energy flowing out, which is very important, because when you're talking about electromagnetic waves, the question that you really ask yourself is how much energy is this wave carrying? Right? If you want to think of the wave as something real which goes from one place to another, the energy is a very important thing to look at. But when you ask about energy flow, what is that related to? The rate at which energy flows across a surface? Have you done that yet in electromagnetism? You may not have. There is something called a Poynting vector. Have you done that yet?
No, sir.
Okay, you will in your waves and optics course as well as in the EM course later. But haven't you done this in the waves and optics course in the second semester? Maybe not, because maybe you didn't go that far. But in the electromagnetism course, you will definitely do this. There is a theorem in electromagnetism which is called Poynting theorem, which essentially says that the way in which electromagnetic energy in a region can decrease is either by expending energy in the form of heat by making the charges move, or by flowing out. That flowing part is described by something called a Poynting vector, which is E cross B. Or not really E cross B, there are extra factors. But the important point is this cross product between two different vectors is a multiplication, and that's nonlinear. So just like the calculation of power that we discussed in the last class, here also you have to be very careful. You have to take the real parts first for the actual electric and magnetic fields, and then take their cross product, rather than multiply them using a cross product of the complex vectors and then integrate, then average that out. That will give you, that again will give you 0, just the way power calculation, the way we did it wrongly, gave us 0 in the last class. Okay, so you have to be careful. You have to be, but that is always true. Whenever you use complex quantities to denote what are actually real, you have to be careful about the conditions in which you can actually use those. Okay. Any questions related to electronics, or not electronics yet, electricity?
Sir, I had a doubt regarding the extra element theorem.
Yeah.
We proved that part of the that extra element theorem using the Z equivalence circuits.
Right.
But that calculation of the Z equivalent circuits we did considering the small signal approximation, right?
Exactly. So the extra element theorem is also valid under the same approximation.
Oh.
It's perfectly correct for linear devices, and resistances, capacitances, inductances, for that is precise. Okay, as I explained in the last class also, we were saying small signal SA analysis, but using it for DC in all the examples. But that was because if you are dealing with linear circuits, then the Z parameters are actually independent of your operating point. So you could just as well take zero current, etc. to be your quiescent point, zero current, zero voltage. And then the fluctuation from the quiescent point, which is actually what you are really looking at, is nothing but the actual value of the voltage and the current. And not only that, then the equation is exactly correct. After all, what is the approximation here? The approximation here is that you are using Taylor series and stopping at the linear order. But if the equations are already linear, stopping at the linear order is not an approximation. There are no higher order terms which you are ignoring. So for linear devices, extra element theorem, which is a consequence, which we proved as a consequence of the Z parameter equivalent network, is actually exact. But for nonlinear devices, it's the small signal approximation. However, let me also point out that the extra element theorem actually has many other versions. This was one of the simplest versions of the theorem. The other versions can be proved independently in other ways. But once again, the result stays true. These are really small signal approximate results. But that is actually the single most important application you will ever need in most cases. I'm not saying that you will never need to worry about non-linearities. You will. But you need to first gather a very thorough understanding of the linear behavior. Non-linearities can be understood after that. Okay. Anything else?
Sir,
Okay.
I had a question regarding problem given in the assignment.
Mhm.
So,
Which
in order to
which
find
assignment, which problem?
in the last assignment
Okay.
for
Is it problem
question
number
number
3 by any chance?
yeah, it was question number 3.
Yeah.
So
Was
the
it
thing
all?
was
Is
that
it also related to the solution that I gave?
not really. It's kind of the solution that means both actually. Solution I got and the solution that you did. Thing
Yeah,
is
the
that
solution that I did was wrong.
okay,
You should
so
have. There was a comment which I made in VLearn, and in fact, in the discussion forum, I did say it's wrong. I don't even remember why I made such a stupid mistake, but I think it was because I viewed the circuit wrong. May not be.
yeah, I think my question is not exactly
Okay.
that.
Okay.
My question
Then go
is
ahead.
that when we are using the Z parameter circuit,
Mhm.
so we have Z input, output, reverse, and forward, right?
Yeah.
So when we are doing the calculations, we find out that everything except Z forward is positive and only Z forward is negative. And by using that only, we get the proper solutions.
Mhm.
So my question is, does negative impedance in this case have any physical significance or is just a
Uh,
mathematical
Well,
glitch
first
or
of
something?
all, the answer is twofold. Actually, I've already answered this question in the last day. This was also
Uh,
asked in the last class, but let me just repeat once again. The input impedance and the output impedance, Zi and Zo, these are actually modeled as impedances. Okay? Right? In your equivalent circuit, they are actually impedances.
yes.
But ZR and ZF are really not impedances per se. ZF, for example, the forward forward Z parameter or Z forward, you call it the forward impedance, but it's really the ratio between the voltage, so equivalent voltage source connected at the output to the current in the input. It's called forward because the current in the input is affecting the output. So that's the forward direction in our thoughts. So from input to output. That's why we call it the forward impedance. And it's called an impedance because it's a ratio between a voltage and a current, and so it has the dimensions of an impedance. But is it really an impedance? No, it's a proportionality factor in a current controlled voltage source. So negative value there would simply mean that when the current flows in, remember I1 is positive when the current is flowing in at the input terminal. Then the voltage at the output terminal will be negative. That's all it means. Okay. It does
So it
not
means the
have,
voltage's sign will be changed, right?
yeah, voltage source sign will be changed. It has no other connotation.
Okay.
You might ask, is it possible to have negative impedance? In fact, sometimes you will see later on in the course that it is. At least it's possible to have effective negative impedance circuits. And negative impedance circuits basically mean that in such circuits, current flows in the opposite direction to the way the voltage should make it flow. Okay. In other words, voltage flow, if you have a high voltage to a low voltage scenario, current will flow from high voltage to low voltage. In a negative impedance circuit, current will actually flow from low to high.
Yeah,
That
so that
happens,
means the direction of current and that of voltage are reversed.
but that is a different, there are two different things. One is this particular case, when I talk about ZF I1, remember I1 is a current somewhere else, right? And this voltage is
another
somewhere
circuit.
else, right? So here the negative sign simply tells you about the way these signs are related. Nothing more than that. It says nothing about energy being given out or taken in or anything. Okay. Whereas when if I really had a negative impedance, not something which is negative and which has a dimension of impedance, which is the case with ZF. But suppose Zi had been negative. What would that have told you? It would have told you that when current flows from one end to the other of Zi, instead of the voltage dropping, it would rise. Now that is actually possible. It's not impossible, but that is possible only if you have external energy sources. Because from current to flow in the direction of voltage rise requires energy, right?
If there's another source which is more powerful than this one.
There's some other source somewhere in the circuit which is making things go that way. Yeah. We will see examples of negative impedance circuits. In fact, they are very, very useful and very important. But they are not something which happens out of passive components. You need active components for that. You essentially need some source of power, which by proxy, which does not directly perhaps drive the current there, but which allows the current to flow there by pumping enough energy into the circuit. We will see that in later circuits. Okay. So, in a sense, negative impedance has a physical meaning. It simply means that when I say negative impedance, I don't mean like ZF. ZF is just something which has the dimensions of impedance. It's not really an impedance. It's a proportionality factor. That being negative simply relates the signs in a particular way of the current I1 and the voltage source there. But a proper negative impedance through which current flows and the voltage rises in the direction of current flow is actually a very useful circuit component in many things. It can act as a source of energy. Of course, it's not really a source of energy directly. It borrows this energy from a power source, but does so in a very particular manner. We will see examples of that in later classes. So, for example, oscillators, or you want to have self-sustaining oscillations, they would actually depend on such sources. Okay. Next. Okay, if there are no questions, I hope there are none right now. Let me just ask you people a simple question. I will have to draw a Wheatstone bridge here, which is painful with my very meager drawing skills. But anyway, this sort of looks like a Wheatstone bridge, right? Let's say R1, R2. And the only new thing that I'm doing here is, well, I'm doing two new things. First of all, I am actually using a square wave generator at the input. Okay. You know what a square wave generator is, right? So for part of the time, it gives a positive voltage. For part of the time, it gives a negative voltage. If it's a symmetric square wave generator, it produces positive voltage for some period of time and a negative voltage for the same period of time. For half the time period, the output is positive. For half of it is negative. But say maybe plus 12 volts, minus 12 volts, plus 12 volts, minus 12 volts, and so on. Okay, if this were to flow, if were to be, well, if such a square wave generator were used in a circuit like this and you connected a current measuring device here, okay, and let's say the current measuring device can actually measure the current at every instant so that you can get a waveform. It's possible by using a cathode ray oscilloscope, for example, a CRO, a device which you will hopefully use next semester in the lab, really. I'm hoping that next semester you will be in the lab. But if you have such a device, and this is your circuit, what would the current waveform look like?
Well,
Yes,
it will be square.
it will be a square, right? Exactly. And basically, this is really, of course, I called it a Wheatstone bridge, but it's not a Wheatstone bridge. It's just a series parallel combination, right? So these R1, R2 are in series, R3, R4 are in series, and they are together parallel. What would have made it a Wheatstone bridge is that if we had a resistance here. Okay, suppose I did have a resistance here. Then what would the waveform here look like? Okay, somebody is chatting. Same. Okay, you are saying same. When you say same, I hope you mean same qualitatively. That is, it will still look like a square wave. Right? Not the same as in identical, because the presence of this resistance will, of course, change the effective resistance in the circuit. So the amount of current which will flow will be different. Okay, fine. But now let's ask the real question. So you all know what a diode is, right? You've done diodes in class 11 or 12. So suppose I had connected a diode here. Then what would the waveform look like?
Will it get rectified?
What? Sorry, couldn't hear you. Will it get what?
Sir, only half
Rectified.
of the waveform.
So you expect to get only, suppose this is your waveform, the output looks like this.
Sir, only the positive part. Or
Only the
negative
positive
part, depending on the phase.
Or only the negative part?
Yes, sir.
Which one?
So depending upon the resistance ratios, I guess.
So depending on the resistance ratios, what? Only the positive or only the negative? I see one answer in the chat from Shivam Kumar, and he is saying, okay, let's see what he is saying. Square wave is lower magnitude in negative side. Okay, Shivam is saying positive and negative both will be present. So Shivam, could you just explain that? So Shivam has a different answer. What Shivam is saying is something like this. A square wave, but a smaller value on the negative side. The other two answers is only positive or only negative. And one version is either this or that, depending on the resistance ratios. What Shivam is saying is something like this. So let's put this to a vote. How many of you would say that this is right? So both positive and negative Arkadeep could also mean this. That is square wave.
No, sir, both positive and negative with different magnitudes. But again, if the Wheatstone bridge is in a balanced condition, then it will be a square wave.
Good. If the Wheatstone bridge were balanced, then of course the presence of the diode would make no difference whatsoever, right? Because the diode will not get any current either way, right? So if the Wheatstone bridge were balanced, since no current flows to the bridge arm, whether the bridge arm is connected or not connected makes no difference. So whether the diode is conducting or not conducting makes absolutely no difference. So done. This part would not make a difference provided you're talking about a balanced Wheatstone bridge. But not talking about balanced Wheatstone bridge, so Shivam is saying, I don't see the diode's use. By which you are seemingly saying what? Apparently there is a use, right? You yourself said that the diode is not acting to stop the wave, I agree. But you were apparently saying that the two parts are going to be different, right? You were saying something like this. Without the diode, of course, you would get a symmetric square wave. Symmetric meaning not only symmetric in time, but symmetric in value, positive, negative, equal. I thought you were saying this. Positive, negative for equal times, but with different values. So are you still saying this one or are you saying this? Because you don't see the diode's use. If diode doesn't do anything, then you should really see a symmetric thing. Okay, so Arkadeep, let's follow up on your answer, which is similar. You're saying both positive and negative, but different depending on what?
Depending on whether the Wheatstone bridge is in balanced condition.
Okay, fine. If it's in balanced condition, it's going to be symmetric. We agree. If it's not in balanced condition, can you tell me whether it's going to be like this one or like this one or this one or like this one? So A, B, C, D, and a special case of both C and D is when it's symmetric. That is both equal positive, equal negative.
Sir, can I say something? Like
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
had something in mind.
Go ahead.
Say for the first half, when the current is flowing in the direction of the diode, say the Wheatstone bridge is not in fact balanced. So if it's flowing in the direction of the diode, so we can just
No,
replace
wait a
it
minute,
by
wait a minute, wait a minute. In the direction of diode means what? First half
means-
essentially means this side is positive, this side is negative. So the current is flowing this way. That's what first half
Yeah.
means. Now, go ahead.
Okay, so the thing is, if the current flows from the top to the bottom of the diode, then it flows, and for diode, if it tries to go from the opposite direction, it does not.
Right.
So if we take two cases, one where we short it and one where we just keep the ends disconnected, so we
Yeah.
will get two cases. So for one, the
That's
resistance
called
becomes
open. Keep it open. Short it as opposed to open it out.
yeah,
There's a,
and in that
there's a language. Okay. Go ahead.
yeah. So in that case, the effective resistance will change, and so the that's should change the wave, means the current that is needed. So in one sense, it should be higher, and in one sense, it should be smaller.
Good. But which one will be which? How do you decide that?
Uh,
So how do you decide? So there are two halves of this motion, right? One in which the current is flowing like this, the other in which the current is flowing like. In fact, it will flow in both directions. So these A and B are out. They are not really correct. Current will flow in both directions. In one of them, the current will flow from top to bottom. In the other, from bottom to top. At least try to. Of course, in the one in which it tries to flow from top to bottom, the diode, if you assume it to be an ideal diode, behaves like a short. So basically, you have R1, R3 parallel, R2, R4 parallel, and the combination in series. So then it will be V0 by and in the other half, when current would try to flow this way from bottom to top, of course, the diode will not allow such current to flow. So diode will behave like an open circuit then. Then it will be V0 by R1 plus R2 parallel to R3 plus R4. Okay, so these are the two different currents that will flow. Magnitudes. The question is, how would you decide which half corresponds to which current? So I agree with all you are saying. So Shivam, in fact, you said the right thing to begin with, but now your final answer is actually wrong. It's not a square wave with same magnitudes. It's a Wheatstone bridge case. I don't understand what do you mean by Wheatstone bridge case. You mean balanced Wheatstone bridge case or not?
Yes, sir. When R1 by R2 is equal to R2 by R4.
Yeah, that is not the Wheatstone bridge case. That's a special case of the Wheatstone bridge. Okay. That's a balanced Wheatstone bridge case. Okay. For the balanced Wheatstone bridge case, as I said, it should not make any difference because whether the diode is there or not makes no difference. Current does not flow through that anyway. So you should get the same value for both cases. By the way, these are the two different values for the currents. You should check for yourself that for the balanced Wheatstone bridge case, these two are actually equal. Because if R1 by R2 is actually equal to R3 by R4, there is no distinction between this current and this current. They actually become equal to each other, which is expected, right? Because in the balanced case, no current flows through the middle. But there is also no potential drop between these 2 points, right? There's no, in the balanced case, there is no potential drop between these 2 points. Neither does the current flow. So you can either treat them as an open circuit because current is not flowing, or treat it like a short circuit because there's a potential drop. Either case, you should get exactly the same result. And you can check for yourselves that the effective resistance you get in both cases will be exactly the same. But the question that I have for all of you is, when the bridge is not balanced, we realize that these will be the two currents. One, this is the case when the diode behaves like a closed short circuit, that is, the diode is forward biased, and this is when the diode is reverse biased. But the only question left is which is which. How do you decide when the diode is forward biased or as opposed to when the diode is reverse biased?
It will depend on R1 and R3's resistance.
Close. It will depend not only on R1 and R3, it will depend on all 4 resistances. Actually. But how would you figure out?
By taking effective resistance in series like R1 and R2's resistance and comparing it with the R3 and R4.
So how would you? So what will that tell you?
That can tell me that where from the current will flow, and then
No, but
it can.
True, but in the sense you have gone this far, why don't you tell me the answer? What exactly would you look at?
The ratios.
So let's call these 2 points P and Q. What you need
that
for the diode to be forward bias is what? Vp to be bigger than Vq, right?
yes. Then only current will flow through diode and it will
Yeah,
be
but what is the
forward biased.
condition for that in terms of the resistances? Can you tell me that?
Hmm.
Or to be precise, what is the condition that when current flows this way, the diode is forward biased?
R1 times effective is it will be some ratio.
Okay, I'm surprised that nobody mentioned one theorem which would have immediately told you the answer. You don't really need that theorem, but since you have really studied that theorem very recently, I thought that that would be the obvious thing to use here. Look, you are worried about what will happen through the diode, right? But the trouble is there is a rather complicated circuit connected to the diode. Some bunches of resistances and a voltage source and so on. Now, if you had this, would you be able to tell me whether this diode is forward biased or not?
Yes.
Yes.
So when will it be forward biased?
When V is positive.
When V is positive, right? Now that was meant to be a hint, because no matter how complicated your circuit is, there is a circuit, there's a diode as part of the circuit. Why don't you just imagine that this diode is outside a black box, the rest of it is inside a black box? Then what will the circuit inside the black box look like? Yes?
Thevenin equivalent.
Yeah, it would look like a Thevenin equivalent, which is just this. So all you really need is a Thevenin voltage between the points P and Q. If that's positive, the diode will be forward biased. If that's negative, the diode will be reverse biased. As simple as that. Okay. So, by the way, Thevenin equivalent is a bit of an overkill here. You don't really need to know Thevenin's theorem to be able to work this out. But I'm a bit surprised that after studying Thevenin's theorem and doing some problems in that, I would have thought the first thing that comes to everybody's mind would be, okay, now that I want to know what happens to the diode with connected to something complicated, I will just replace the complicated thing by a Thevenin equivalent. And then I will be done. That would be the natural thing to do, in my opinion. Okay. Anyway, my point is, you should be able to see several situations where replacing complicated circuits by Thevenin equivalence would make life a lot simpler for you. Okay. So Thevenin's theorem actually is very useful that way. Although, what I would say is, in this case, you don't really need that. Suppose current were flowing this way. Okay. Now, okay, let me just give you two specific numbers. Let's say this is 4 kilo ohms and this is 1 kilo ohm. And let's say this one not a balanced bridge, right? 4 by 1 is not equal to 1 by 2. But now can anybody tell me, is this diode going to be, when the current is flowing this way, that is when the positive half of this input cycle has occurred, is the diode going to be forward biased or reverse biased? the same positive voltage is being dropped across these two ends, right? Now think of Thevenin's theorem in the sense that how do you get the Thevenin voltage? You get the Thevenin voltage by disconnecting this, right? So the Thevenin voltage will be obtained between, and the voltage between these 2 points. And you're asking whether P is positive or Q is positive. How do you decide whether P or Q is positive? This is actually class 10, no more than that. The advanced stuff was Thevenin's theorem, but class 10 will be fine for this.
We decide the current and then like decide the voltage.
One good thing is you could find out the current in both branches, right? Because you know that whatever voltage V0 you have, that's dropped across the parallel combination. So same voltage across both. So V0 by 5K through this, V0 by 3K through the other. But that's really not that important here. That is something that you can definitely use. But there's a much easier way. These two things are in series, right? 4K and 1K. When two resistors are in series, which one drops higher voltage?
The one with the
bigger
higher
one.
resistance.
The bigger one, right? So among these two, which one drops the higher resistance, higher voltage?
4K.
And here?
2K.
2K. So which voltage is higher, P or Q?
Q is higher.
Why?
Because the drop through 1K is less than the drop through 4K.
Exactly. The only thing you have to worry about is drop, right? 4K voltage, or you could make it easier for yourself by thinking of the 1K and the 2K. Here if you think in terms of 4K and 1K, you have to think of the fact that there is a bigger drop through 4K and a smaller drop through 1K. Not because this is 4, this is 1, but because this is 4 compared to this 1, this is 1 compared to this 2. Right? Overall, the same drop across the two series combinations. If you look from this point to this point, you have the same drop in both cases. But that drop is divided with a higher voltage drop across 4 as opposed to 1, in fact 4 times higher. And here, a lower drop across 1 compared to 2, in fact 1/3 of the entire drop. I don't even need the 1/3 or 4/5. All I need is bigger drop here, smaller drop here, which means the voltage at P is actually less than the voltage at Q, right? Because this voltage is the same.
So we can also say that for 5K and 3K, the current through 3K is higher.
Yeah, current through 3K is higher, but that will not tell you anything, because if you were to look, that alone would not tell you anything, because if you were to swap the 2 and 1, it's not the overall resistance which matters, it's the ratio which matters. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Suppose I suppose 1 and 2 and 1 would still work the same way, but suppose I had 2.5 and 0.5. Note that this is still 3K, right? This is still 5K. But if it's 2.5 and 0.5, the ratio of 2.5 and 0.5 ensures that there's a bigger drop across 2.5. Because 2.5 is actually 5 times the other resistance. Do you get my point? So it's not just the value of the total resistance which matters, it's the ratio which matters. Got it? In a series, yes, potential is divided in the ratio of the resistance. That's all you really need to worry about. So since 4:1, there's the ratio, 4:5 is going to be, 4:1 is the ratio in which this gets divided. In the other case, in the original case where you had 1 and 2, this is much easier. This is 1:2. 1:2, of course, is a lot larger, a lot smaller than 4:1, right? And therefore, what happens? 1:2 is smaller, so smaller drop, larger drop, P ends up being lower. It's not the total resistance which matters, it's the resistance ratio between R1, R2, R3, between these resistances. Is this ratio between R2, R1 which matters, not, and compared to R3, R4 ratio. Of course, if these ratios were exactly equal, then you would get a balanced bridge, in which case either result would be exactly the same. So that also works out. You should see that there's a consistency among the results. Okay. Is that I'm not saying that you cannot calculate this by first finding out the current through each resistance and multiplying the current by the resistance and so on to find the voltage drop. You can do all that. All I'm saying is easier when you're focusing on a question as to whether there's a bigger voltage at P and than Q. All you have to ask is, you're starting from a common point. To get to P, there's a larger drop. That's all you need. And for that, all you need is the fact that in a series, voltage gets divided in proportion to resistance. By the way, it's actually easier not to use this, but to use this. Because you end up at the same voltage at the end, but whichever has a higher drop, that voltage will be larger. That will be easy. That's even easier. Here, it may slightly confuse you because the higher drop ends up being lower. On the other hand, here, when you go from P or Q to this common point, then higher drop is higher voltage. That should be pretty easy to figure out. It's just that in one case, there's one common voltage from which you're coming down. So if you come down more, you end up lower. And in the other case, you're both going down towards the common value. So if you go down more, you must have started out higher. That's easy for you to, it should be easy for you to figure out. So there's nothing very unusual or esoteric about what I'm saying. All I'm saying is there are several ways of thinking about things, but when you are dealing with circuits, these simple results that voltages divide in a series in the resistance ratio, currents divide in parallel in inverse ratio of resistance. These results are things which you should be able to use quickly, because that's how you will be able to understand many of these features that we are going to talk about much more easily. If you have to calculate every current and every voltage difference to get to the answer, that might take too long. Okay? Of course, there's nothing wrong with taking too long. All I'm saying is there are usually easier ways of understanding certain features based on the knowledge of how circuits behave. That is going to be very important. Okay, I've already overshot the time today. So anybody, unless anybody has a pressing question, we will fold up today. Okay, bye for now.